Bernadette Jones is a freelance HR consultant. She is certified as a senior professional in human resources, one of only 4,300 SPHRs in California. She has firsthand experience in small business, developing an HR department while growing from 2 to 10 and then as many as 15 employees. So let's talk about your business background. You didn't start as an HR professional. You started in business.
Correct, yes. I started off as an office manager for a small two-person service firm. And shortly after that, we were awarded some government contracts, which meant that we had to comply with a number of different employment laws. And so that required me to get some training in employment law and to make sure that we were compliant. And then soon after that, we were awarded a contract, a large contract with Pacific Bell at that time. And from that, we went from 2 people up to 10 people almost overnight. Wow. And the CEO and I immediately realized that I needed additional training. And so at that time, I went to Cal State Hayward and took their Human Resource Management certificate program. Okay. And so worked through that and got the background and took a number of different classes after that over the years and really honed in on my profession. Right. And then eventually I qualified to take the SPHR test and became certified.
And then now you're doing HR full-time.
Yes, I'm doing HR full-time. I'm a consultant, freelance consultant, and so I work with medium and small-sized businesses, really helping them to really make sure that their HR is strategic and it works with them on a daily basis.
Okay. When you were back with the 2 employees, or for people in the audience who have smaller organizations, what are the first things that people really need to address, the most important minimum standards they need to meet for HR that won't get themselves in trouble?
Well, I think the most important thing for a small business, when you have an employee, even one employee, is to have your payroll done. And my suggestion is to use a payroll company to do that. It really keeps you compliant. You don't miss anything. It helps you to understand when you need to pay overtime, what the minimum wages are, all those kinds of things. It's very helpful, and it doesn't cost a lot. So that's outsourcing just a small portion of your human resource management duties. Right. So I think that's very important because once you hire one employee, there's over 14 federal regulations that you have to comply with. Wow. With one employee.
Yeah, I know every time I've run afoul of anything regarding HR, it's always been those times when I had one time a bookkeeper, well, actually twice, bookkeepers have talked me into, oh, it's so easy now, we can do it ourselves, no problem. It's like trouble every time. It's just too easy to make a mistake.
It is.
And one mistake will cost you,
with the payroll is not a lot of money. So as a small business owner, you typically can afford to have that done. So it's not a lot of money. And a lot of the agencies that do your payroll, the companies will actually give you additional information. They're very helpful because they want you to, again, buy into additional services. Right. So they're very helpful.
Okay. So what would be, other than payroll, what's like the next, what would be like the next thing to consider?
The next thing to consider is before you start hiring, is what your goal is. You want to make sure that when you hire, you obey all the laws and regulations as far as even advertising the position. Make sure you have a job description. You know what you want them to do, and they know what your employee knows what you want them to do. You want to have an employee handbook, which many times that payroll company will assist you in putting together an employee handbook.
Really, even very just important for one employee.
For one employee.
See, I never even thought about doing that till I had more,
Yes.
a whole group of people.
Mm-hmm. It eliminates a lot of issues, and so if the basic things are set out in an employee handbook, like you're an at-will employer. Okay, so you want to make sure things like that are in the employee handbook. What are the benefits, if any? How are holidays handled? So all of those things with one employee it is very important because one employee could cost you a lot of money if you don't do it right.
Right. Yeah, that is a burden. I know, for so long we would just sort of, holidays would come up and we just look around and go, hey, are we taking this holiday or are we working? It was very, very, very informal, but I guess I've been lucky.
Yes, yes. And, some of the statistics say that because with a small business, you typically have higher turnover than a larger business. And the Department of Labor says that 50% of employees leave within the first 6 months. So the more turnover you have, the more the increased liability you have for wrongful termination, lawsuit, discrimination in hiring, and wrongful termination lawsuit can cost you upwards of $85,000 just to be represented.
Right. That's
Now,
not even if you lose the case.
right, that's just right or wrong. Okay, but if you lose the case, the average settlement is $500,000.
Wow. Well, that would
So-
put a lot of small businesses right out of business.
A lot of small businesses out. So that's something to be very concerned about. And so hence the idea of making sure that you have human resources support. Even if you don't have an individual person within the company who is a human resource professional, learn as much as you can. And just assign one person to just be as acquainted with human resource law as they can. There's so much you can learn on the internet. You know, so if you have one person that's responsible for that, and then you can supplement that with professional help from an HR company, a professional employers organization, a payroll company,
Or someone like yourself.
or someone like myself, independent consultant, that is the best thing you want to do starting off. So you don't have a huge expense, but at the same time you're protecting yourself.
Okay. Any particular websites that are really valuable for
Let's see, the Department of Labor, DFEH, which is the Department of Fair Housing, Fair Employment and Housing, which will have a lot of laws that you have to comply with. So those are some good places to start.
Okay, so let's jump right in and talk about like the minimum requirements for a business. One employee, you know, when you get to 2 or 5, 10, you know, what are some of the things that people need to know at these stages?
Well, when you first hire your first employee, you have to comply with the FLSA, which is the Federal Labor Standards Act, and that governs pay for overtime, minimum wage, and then child labor laws. So you want to be very familiar with that. When do you have to pay overtime? What's the minimum wage? You want to become familiar with what is an exempt and a non-exempt employee, independent contractor versus an employee.
And we will go into independent contractor later.
Okay. Yes, because those are very important because that can get you in a lot of trouble. So you want to be conscious of those laws. Then also the Immigration Standards Act, which makes you responsible for verifying that every employee is legal and available and able to work in the United States. So that means verifying ID, and you know everybody's familiar now. When you come for a job, you bring your Social Security card, a passport, and driver's license, or some of those items that really identify that you're able to work in the United States. So you want to be conscious that you're doing that. And then just make sure that when you do payroll, whether you use a bookkeeper, you do it yourself, or a payroll company, everything that all the deductions are on the employee's paycheck stub. So a lot of small businesses will write a personal check or they'll write a business check.
Right.
And that doesn't account for the deductions. You don't see the deductions. You want to make sure that you make those deductions. So those are the first things that are most important when you hire an employee. And then you want to work on your handbook and getting a handbook together, some policies, so that everybody knows what the employee is expected to do.
So you need a handbook even for one employee?
Even for one employee, you should have a handbook because that's going to cover so many portions of the Fair Labor and Standards Act. You're going to cover that in your employee handbook. So it's going to make you aware and make the employee aware of what the rules are, what the laws are, and so that you're aware that you're not violating anything. And then it also lets the employee know if you are an at-will employer. So you haven't entered into a contract where an employee can say, well, you know, you hired me to work for a year, so I have at least a year to work here.
Right.
So you clear all those kinds of things up in your handbook.
So it's almost a contract.
Yes. It tells you what are all the rules and regulations to work at this company. What are we expected to do, and what do we expect you to do? And so that clarifies a lot.
And at the very minimum, you can find one of these somewhere, maybe on the internet, and modify it to your needs.
What I would do, for instance, the California Chamber of Commerce has a handbook that you can actually customize, do a lot of customizing for California employees. So you want to make sure that your handbook relates to California or whatever state that you're in. So you are stating what laws and regulations apply to your state
Okay, so
and
that's
your
very important. If you do
employees.
find something on the internet, make sure it's applicable in your own state.
Correct.
Because these laws, the labor laws, are guided state by state.
State by state. So you want to make sure that you're complying with those rules and regulations.
Okay, great. So you have one employee. What's another thing that you need to do?
Well, you need to post all of the federal and state laws. And there are a number of different posters that will combine all of the laws on one big poster you can put on a door or a wall. And that kind of informs the employees of all their rights. And if something happens that's illegal, it tells them where they can go to solve that problem. So in line with the handbook, you have your posted notifications, and that really covers you so that you can eliminate a lot of liability.
And you really need to put those posters up somewhere?
You definitely need to. It can be in a break room, it could be on a back wall, just someplace where employees frequent, and so that they'd be able to see that information.
Even in a home-based business?
Even in a home-based business, if you have an employee on the wall.
So as you grow, what are some of these thresholds that you hit where suddenly more laws kick in?
Well, number one, the first employee, you have laws and regulations. Then at 10 employees, there's a new threshold. 15 employees, there's another threshold, 20. And then from 20, it goes to 50 and 100.
Okay.
So,
but even at 10 employees, so that's the next threshold after 1 is really 10.
Correct. And also, but the other thing you want to be conscious of is if you are a contractor for the government or even a subcontractor, there are additional laws that you have to follow if you're a contractor
Even
for the
if you have one
government.
employee.
Federal laws, yes. And they start at like $10,000.
Wow.
You know, if you have a $10,000 contract or subcontract with the government, then there are certain laws you have to comply with. There's affirmative action laws that you have to comply with. You have to be able to prove that you're not discriminating in your hiring practices. You may have to prove that you have an anti-drug policy in your business.
Wow.
So those are the kinds of things that
Even
you
for
wanna-
just a few employees or one employee?
Yes.
Okay.
So originally, as I mentioned, I started off with the two-person service company. We had government contracts. We had to comply with those laws.
Okay.
Yes.
So that's why you went and got some professional help
Correct.
immediately to make sure. Of course, you jumped to the 10 employee threshold, so you really needed
Exactly. Needed even more help.
even more help.
And then at that point, more than the compliance is dealing with the employees.
Right.
So now you have to make sure you hire the right people,
Right.
that they get the proper training, and that your employees are engaged and motivated, and they want to be with the company because your brand is what they're representing. And so you want to make sure that you have employees that represent your brand correctly.
So let's jump right into starting to talk about employees. We'll get into hiring the right employees in a minute. But when is a good trigger, do you think, to consider? For a lot of folks, they're a solo operator, and the question of when do I hire my first employee? When do I know it's right, or when should I just be using a freelancer? And then later on, when is a good indication it's time to grow?
Okay, so that's a good question. Employee versus freelancer. So one of the things you want to look at if you're growing and you feel like you need an employee to help you, you want to consider what is the difference with a freelancer. Do you need more control over the person? If you need more control, you may want to consider having your own employee. Do you want someone to be able to bring a lot of experience dealing with businesses to the table? Then you may want a freelancer. Or do you need a lot of control over the quality of the product or whatever it is that your output is, and you need to control exactly how that process is done? Then you may want an employee. So it just depends on what it is that you're hiring or considering hiring that person to do. Sometimes you want to bring a freelance person in because they have a lot more expertise in a particular area. They may have more expertise than the business owner does. And so at that point, if you need that, you may want to bring in a freelance person. When you make those decisions, you want to consider all the expenses that are involved with an employee. So when you have an employee, employment taxes, benefits if you're going to offer those, vacation time, all of those things go into the budget for your employee. then you want to compare that with the budget for a freelance person, where you don't have all of those expenses, but the hourly rate is much higher.
Right.
So all of those things you want to take into consideration, and just really focus on what do you need that person to do, and who's going to be the best choice.
When you look at what the IRS considers a contractor versus what they consider an employee, a lot of people get themselves in trouble with this. But it almost seems like everybody I've known who's hired a freelancer on a regular basis could be construed as violating these laws. So it seems like, there's what is actually practiced versus what the law says, and how does one think about that? Because it's like you can't tell them when to show up.
Right.
And that seems like kind of a ridiculous thing. If there's an appointment with a client, obviously they have, and you're hiring somebody to do it, they have to be there at a certain time.
Right. So that's a good question, and they do have to be there at a certain time. So that's different from saying your work hours are 9 to 5. Okay, so that's a big difference. Or from saying, okay, you're going to create, I want you to work on this software program, okay, and then they go back to their office and they figure out what processes they're going to use to develop that software. If they're going to hire someone else to come in and help them, they figure all that out. Okay, that's an independent contractor. But if you say to the person, okay, I want you to work on developing this software and I want you to come in at this time, this is the parameter I want you to use to develop it, and these are the resources that you have to develop it, so then that's obviously an employee.
I see.
An independent contractor is going to provide their own resources. One good thing to look at is, do they have a business license? If they have a business license, that's a good indicator that they are an independent contractor. Do they have insurance? That's a good indicator of it. Versus someone that has no business license, they have no insurance, they have no other clients, you're their sole client,
Well,
then it's obvious that they are an employee. And many times people will say, oh no, they're not an employee, but I'm your only client. So that's something that you want to look carefully at. But, there are checklists that you can actually use and just go down the checklist that will help you to see, okay, is this person an employee or they're an independent contractor? And actually, California Chamber of Commerce has, small businesses can join the California Chamber of Commerce, and they have an HR section on their website where you can download so many different forms. And one of those forms is independent contractor versus an employee. And it's a checklist. You can go down the checklist and determine whether or not that person is an employee. And it makes it real simple. But it is based on an individual position. So there's no blanket.
So what about things like Odesk, TaskRabbit, and these things where you're using a freelancer but somebody else is paying for it? Are those pretty kosher? Are you usually safe with those?
I would think so. I don't have a lot of experience, but I have checked out TaskRabbit, and that would appear to be just strictly independent. You're hired to do a particular task, and when that task is complete, you move on to the next one. So that would seem to be, pretty straightforward.
Okay.
Unless you modified it in some way.
Right. So when the decision is made to hire someone, we know what work needs to be done, and what other factors go into doing that decision beyond just finding someone who can do the work?
Okay, so one of the biggest factors that you want to consider is fit. You want to make sure that the person is a good fit for your company. And so beyond the basic tasks, because, typically you can almost always find someone who has the skill level to do the task that you want. But that person may have the skill level, but they won't fit in with your company. And so that's the biggest thing. You want to hire for fit.
How do you determine if there's a fit?
Okay. First thing you want to determine is what kind of company you are. You hear a lot of buzz about company culture, organizational culture. You really should sit down and figure out, what kind of culture do I have here in my organization? So are you customer-centered? Are you a customer-centered type company? And that's the main thing, is you want your customers to be happy. A lot of people say that, businesses, right, but they're not really. So you want to determine, is that your culture? Are you productivity driven? Is fast paced? We have to get this product out immediately, and it's just move, move, move. Is your selling point quality? So your big selling point is the quality. That's what makes you stand out, is the quality of your merchandise. People are going to pay extra money for it. So you want to look at all those kinds of things that are going to develop your culture. So say, for instance, if you are a productivity-centered organization and you make your money based on being able to put a product out quickly, and you hire someone that has the skills that you're looking for, but they're not. They're just kind of, slow paced, just kind of go with the flow type person. That's not going to be a good fit. Okay, that's kind of an obvious thing right there,
Right.
but that's not going to be a good fit. And so you want to make sure that the person you hire not only has the skill set that you need, but they also have the temperament that you need. They are interested in customers. They love customer service. If you're a customer service centered organization, you don't want to hire somebody that doesn't like working with people. They may have the skill set, but they don't like working with people. And so those are the kind of things you want to really make sure of, because that one bad hire can lose you a lot of business.
Right. Well, they're not going to stay for very long if they're a bad fit. I mean, either because you can't put up with them or
Right.
because they can't put up with you.
Exactly.
But how, in an interview situation, everybody's trying to put their best face forward, and if they're savvy at all, they kind of figure out what it is that you're looking for, and they try to present themselves in that way. How does one get through that?
I think one of the most important things to do, first off, is when you're recruiting, is get referrals. Okay, particularly if you already have an employee or someone that works in the company, and they're a good employee, get referrals. Get referrals from friends and family that know you and know your business. That's going to eliminate a lot of problems. So it doesn't guarantee, but it'll eliminate a lot of problems, particularly if it's an employee, because they're not going to bring somebody in who's going to jeopardize their job. Right. They're not going to refer you somebody, that may come in and jeopardize their job. So that's the first thing that you can do to try and eliminate some of the problems. Secondly, when you're interviewing, you want to ask questions, and I'm sure you've heard a lot about behavioral interviews and competency questions that you want to ask the interviewee and the candidate. So you want to make sure, okay, so what did you do in this particular situation, or how would you handle a particular situation? Check references, and you do a lot of times get the standard, well, they're worked this day, these between this period, and this is how much they made. They don't want to give up any additional
Especially larger
information.
companies, they're very strict
Right.
about what they'll say and what they want. They worked these days, and that's all you
Right.
can say.
So, and you could ask the person for coworkers.
Oh, okay.
So coworkers may, give up an additional information. LinkedIn is a fabulous place to go and see if you can determine what type of person that is, based on recommendations they may have on LinkedIn, the groups they belong to, different things like that.
Right. No, and I mean, generally beyond that, I suppose if you're looking for personality fit, it could be even Facebook if you can see what their profile or whatever.
Yeah, and you want to be careful about Facebook. That's not really a professional social media area, whereas LinkedIn is. So on Facebook, you come across things that you may not want to come across. Right. You see things that you may say, okay, I'm not going to hire the person, and then you find out the reason you're not hiring them is actually discriminatory. So you want to be careful about that. When you go in, if you cannot separate those things that have to do with employment versus personal life, right, then you want to be careful about using Facebook.
Okay. Yeah, I know, one of the things to consider is what kind of person you are and what kind of people you need around you.
Yeah, and there's a number of different questions you can ask in an interview that will really help. You don't need to have a lot of questions, and I typically like to ask 3 questions that are really good about each position that they've had. So you would ask them, so how did you come to hear about the position that you currently had, or this position on your resume? Go through their resume. How did you hear about the position? You want to look to see if they were referred by someone.
Which is a plus.
Which is a plus. Or if they just went to a job board. Every position they have, they've gone to a job board. You want someone that's been referred, someone that has been recruited by another person, been recruited to the company. Hey, I think it's a great opportunity. Why don't you come over here? You want those kinds of people. You don't want, and when you're first starting off, a lot of your positions will be just advertisements. You applied and you got the job. But as you move on in your career, you want to look for people that were referred and were recruited to the position. Ask them what they were hired to do. Okay, what is it that you were hired to do? So you can see what it is, what was their whole take on the situation? What were you actually hired to do? Okay, and then what would, if I ask for instance, one of the supervisors or their boss, okay, so your manager at this last position, when I call, what is he going to say about you? So it's not like if I call, when I call him, what will he tell me about you?
Right.
Okay, so then that forces a person to really try and think, okay, so what is he actually going to say about me? Because it sounds like he's really going to call.
Right.
You know, and you want to do that. You want to call and check the references. And you want to find out if there's someone who I can talk to who worked with you and knows your work versus just an HR department who's going to give you just the basics.
Right. So you're saying there were 3 questions. And did we cover all 3?
How did you find out about the job? Mm-hmm. What were you hired to do? Mm-hmm. And what would the individual say about you?
Got it.
Okay. And you can ask them about coworkers, management.
Okay.
Each one of those people, what would they say about you?
So what are the different approaches to hiring between an entry-level position and more of a management position?
Well, some of the differences are in the previous question, one of the questions I asked was, how did you find the position? So with entry-level positions, you aren't necessarily expecting the person to come in with a lot of experience. You expect that they answered an ad and they're going to come in and apply for the ad. With entry-level positions, you really want to look at good fit. You want to make sure that even if they don't have all the skills that you need, that they're going to be someone who's trainable, who's open to being trained. Someone who, if it's customer service, who likes dealing with people. So you don't expect them to have all the skills, but you want them to have the right temperament. So with entry-level positions, I would say, without a doubt, make sure that they are a good fit and that they have the temperament that you want them to have, and you're going to be able to train them.
Perfect.
Now, with senior level positions, more importantly now is, how did you find out about the last position you were in? Are people referring you? Are they recruiting you to come to work for them? Or are every new job you get, you're just going in blind and off a job board and nobody's referring you? That's a red flag when you're looking at for senior positions. You want to make sure that with senior positions, that there's some longevity in the assignments that they're in. They're not just going from job to job to job. Of course, then that's a red flag, because there's some reason that they're not staying with the companies that they're at.
Harder in this economy lately.
Yes.
But it can be. How do you look beyond that? If somebody's just been like, what are some of the things that if people have been going from job to job to job, the mitigating circumstances might make them still a good candidate?
It still may make them a good candidate. So one of the things you want to look at is, what kind of recommendations do they have? Do they have letters of recommendation? So you may not be able to get much from an HR department, but do they come with letters of recommendations from those different assignments? That would let you know if there are negative reasons for their going from job to job to job. You know, if they're able to get a great recommendation, maybe they were on temporary assignments and they can get these letters of recommendation, that's something that would change the way that looks. If they've been unemployed for a while, what were they doing during their unemployment? Did they take any kind of classes, any training? Were they going to school? Did they volunteer? All those kind of things help to see that the person is staying active and they're concerned about staying active and professional in their job search. So those are the kinds of things you want to look at. Even more so for a professional person, you want to check LinkedIn. There's over 200 million people, professionals on LinkedIn. So you want to look at that profile and see what it is. You may be able to learn something different from LinkedIn that you wouldn't learn from a resume. So look at the recommendations, if they have recommendations from their colleagues, and what kind of a network they have. Are they staying active in the business world and networking? And particularly with a senior person, where that may be part of their job, is that they go out and meet people, you know, and go out and get new business for you. So what kind of a network do they have?
Yeah, you always have to be suspicious of the marketing person who can't be found on the internet.
Exactly. Exactly. Or the software person that doesn't have a LinkedIn page, doesn't know what LinkedIn page, what LinkedIn is. And I ran into a person like that, you know. They were an IT person, but weren't aware of LinkedIn and wasn't there. So those are the kinds of things that you really want to be conscious of.
And so, what are some things that, as when you're looking to hire people, that you shouldn't do, either because they're illegal or they're just, just not right?
Okay, one big thing that I notice that not just small businesses, some larger businesses do the same thing. When they list a position and put the job description or the requirements, qualifications for the job, they'll list things that have nothing to do with the job. So when you list a qualification, it has to be what's called a BFOQ, which is a bona fide qualification for the occupation. You want to make sure that when you list a qualification, it's bona fide. It is something that has been proven that's going to improve job performance or that is required for that position.
So energetic is okay to say.
Energetic, that's okay. But say
Young is not okay to say.
young is not okay. Recent grad, that's not okay.
That's code for young.
That's code for young. Or a lot of times companies will put bachelor's degree required. You don't need a bachelor's degree for that, for those particular positions. I read an article of one company that basically was bragging about that they only hire college graduates from four-year universities for file clerks. Any position in their company, you had to be a college graduate. Now they've just opened themselves up for all kinds of lawsuits. Because if I come to your company without a college degree and I apply for a job that I'm qualified for and you don't hire me because I don't have a degree, you can't prove that that is a bona fide
It's
qualification.
hard to make a qualification that the college degree is bona fide for anything with all these CEOs without college degrees, right?
It is. It is.
But you see it all the time.
You
Must
see
have
it all the
this.
time. And then so the thing to do with what a lot of companies will do, it'll say BA or bachelor's degree or equivalent experience. So then, but you have to consider people with the equivalent experience. So when you do your job postings, make sure that everything in the description and the posting relates to the job. It's non-discriminatory.
Okay.
So
that's the first thing.
That's the first thing.
What's something else that?
You want to recruit for diversity. So you want to, and diversity is not just in race or gender. You want diversity in culture, diversity in age. You want all those things because as a small business, you're competing globally. And so if you have the same kinds of people, the same age, the same culture, you're not going to be able to compete globally because there's all kinds of people out there. So you want to make sure that you aren't just hiring people like you. You want to hire a diverse array of people so that you can compete globally. So that's very important. And as a small business owners, you can get into the mindset that you want this kind of person.
Right.
And it really has nothing to do with the job. So you want to
You have to question your own perceptions of stuff.
Exactly.
I think would be important. But what about if you aren't interviewing a diverse group of people? Does that expose you to lawsuits?
Yes, it does. Yes.
Even as a small business.
Even as a small business. Even as a small business, because it's illegal to discriminate if you're one person.
I see.
It's illegal to discriminate. So it's harder to prove, of course.
Right.
It's harder to prove. But yes, you're still liable to those same laws and regulations. So, you want to just make sure that you're being fair in your recruiting practices.
So one other thing I noticed on your resume is strategic human resources. And I'd like for you to talk a little about that. I think this answers some of the questions that people have about knowing when to expand their businesses. So if you could let us know, what is strategic human resources?
Well, strategic human resources is working with the business partners to align all of their human resource issues and growth patterns with the strategic plan of the business or with the business plan. So instead of developing a business plan or a strategic plan, and then after it's all developed, you bring in HR and you say, well, we need this many people, or we need this or that. HR should be in at the beginning of that plan. So now, as you're making the strategic plan, you can determine, okay, how many employees is it going to take for us to grow by 10% this year? And what are the positions that we're going to need to fill? Okay. Do we have access to that candidate pool now? Do we have some people who currently work here or who are independent contractors who may want to come on as employees? What talent resources do we already have? And where's that talent going to come from? Are we going to be able to compete for that talent? So those are all the type of questions that you want to consider as you're putting together your strategic plan. So that's why you need HR at the beginning, because now that so many of the jobs revolve around the internet, and it's not so much a lot of product, it's intellectual. And so you really want to make sure that you have the skills necessary to take you through to the next level of your plan. And so those are the considerations that a strategic HR person will make at the beginning. Once you get into that plan, then they can assist you with training, making sure you bring on the right people, you recruit the right people to get you where you need to go. Once you have recruited those people, making sure that they have the correct training. So that comes talent acquisition and talent management. All of that should come under the strategic plan. And that's strategic HR. How do my human resources needs help the business? How can I move it along? Your organization or business culture, how will that fit with our employees? How are our employees going to come in line with the culture? Are they going to be able to work with that culture? Are they going to be able to put across the brand, represent the brand like we want it to be represented? That's part of strategic human resources. And you can align all of those goals with your employees at the same time you're putting together your strategic plan.
And I imagine this can be done even in a very, very small company. It's just instead of bringing in the human resources person, you're putting on your human resources hat, right? To really think about, okay, who's going to do this? So, like with any plan, you have to tweak it and stuff. When do you know that it's time to bring on somebody new that maybe you hadn't anticipated needing?
Well, you want to consider what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Do you have the trained personnel or the trained staff to accomplish that? Do you have the freelance people or independent contractors that can work with you to accomplish that? And if you don't, then you want to consider that it may be time for you to bring on additional employees. Even if it's part-time.
But this comes down to, in some ways, you mentioned freelancers, and so really freelancers should be considered, I guess, when you're putting on that HR hat or when the HR person, they should be considered as part of the human resources available.
Right. What parts of this strategic plan should we outsource?
Doesn't necessarily mean an employee.
Right. Doesn't mean an employee. It may mean that we outsource just a portion of it. It may mean that there's an employee. So you really want to determine, do I need someone full-time or do I need someone that can just produce this product and then go away? I don't need them anymore. So you want to look at those kinds of things. For instance, with human resources, you may want to hire a consultant to work with you while you're putting together a strategic plan. If you don't have those skills available on the management team, you may want to hire a consultant and come in and say, well, this is what I see as far as employees, what you may want to consider, or how many people you may need. You want
Even
to
at the planning stage?
At the planning stage, yes. For instance, and then if you're growing and you say, well, we need to grow by about 25% the next 3 years, how many people is it going to take for us to grow that 25%? And where do we need the skill? So, and that will help you to see if you need to hire someone.
So this brings us down to one of those questions. Is it like, do you hire the skill or do you train and develop? And if either way, what are some of the pitfalls that people fall into?
Well, if you train and develop, the big pitfall would be the speed. How soon can you bring that person up to speed? And are they going to be at the level or the proficiency that you need them to be at? When will that happen?
Realistically.
Realistically, exactly. And so if you need to get a particular skill level immediately, or you need a product or a service that needs to be taken care of immediately, within the next few months, you may need to go ahead and hire someone that already has the skill versus training someone that doesn't have the skill. But many times with a small business, you may have a great employee. You don't really have the money to hire someone, but you can train them. So if you're able to take the time to train the person and bring them up to speed in whatever it is, then that's the way to go.
Yeah, especially with some of the new skills that are being required by even the smallest of businesses,
Exactly.
Internet skills and these sorts of things can be very expensive to bring on.
It can be. And a great example of that is, as I mentioned, I started at a two-person service company, and we got these contracts. And so instead of hiring someone, we didn't have the money to hire anybody to come in and deal with these 10 new people that we've hired. I was trained so that I could do that. And while I was going through the training, we outsourced part of that HR responsibility. And
So that's another strategy, is to outsource for a while you're training, bringing somebody up to speed.
Exactly. So that works out good too if you can do something like that. And working with the PEO or whoever that consultant might be, the consultant might be able to train your employee that you have or the management person that you have. They may be able to train them, and you might be able to negotiate that, or it may not be a problem at all. For instance, the PEO that I worked with, they had no problem. They just, whatever I needed, I called and they talked to me, explained to me what the answer was or where I could go get the answer.
Once people are on board and they're hired, what are some of the pitfalls that especially small businesses find themselves getting into trouble with?
Well, we mentioned a couple of those is making sure that their employees are classified correctly, exempt or non-exempt versus exempt employees. Many people, small businesses, think that, okay, I have this exempt employee, I'm going to pay them a salary, and they work 40 hours a week, and that's it, and I'm just going to pay them a salary. So because you want someone to be exempt doesn't mean they're actually exempt. So you want to make sure that the position that you're hiring for, it actually is an exempt position, because if you don't, then there are going to be overtime issues. If they work over the 40 hours and you don't pay overtime because they're exempt, you're paying them a salary, that can result in huge fines and then back pay for overtime. That's one of the biggest issues with businesses is overtime and exemptions.
So what if you just say, look, I'm not going to pay you overtime, and I want you to work, 40 hours. If you work a little more this week, you take it off next week, and it'll all even out. But work 40 hours, just, that's what I'm authorizing you to do. That doesn't work.
No, that's illegal. You have to pay overtime. If they go past the 40 hours, you have to pay overtime. That's it.
You can't give it back to them next week.
No. And there is some legislation now where they're trying to pass that would allow employers to offer additional time off in lieu of paying the overtime. I don't think that's going to pass, but that is some legislation. But right now, you must pay overtime. Anything over 8 hours a day is overtime. Over 40 hours a week is overtime. And so that has to be paid at time and a half.
What's the difference between exempt and non-exempt employees?
Okay, so exempt employees are typically employees that have management responsibilities. Okay, they have management responsibilities. They may have a number of people that are their direct reports. They have the ability to make decisions. They have some judgment. They have those kinds of responsibilities. It may be an exempt person can also be a professional person, an attorney, a doctor. They may not have direct reports per se, but because of the level of education and where they're working in their profession, they're considered exempt employees.
That's why they work so many hours.
Yes, yes. And you have IT people who can be considered exempt also. So there is a very set standard of duties that a person would have to be responsible for in order to be exempt. And there's a basic minimum salary that they have to make in order for them to be considered exempt. It's not much, but you have to make, I think it's $425 a week. At least. It's not much, but you have to make at least that in order to be considered exempt. Again, as I mentioned at the Chamber of Commerce, they have a whole list you walk through, exempt versus non-exempt. And you can look at each employee and say, do I have them classified correctly? Are they exempt or are they non-exempt? But because you pay someone a salary does not make them exempt.
I see. My wife, who was not an exempt employee, though she was treated exempt, and they said, "Oh, you're just going to sign this off on this person's hours," who she had no supervisory authority over. They just did that so that they could say she was exempt. So as they said, "Oh, you signed his hours." I mean, you could do that with all your employees. Hey, you
Right.
know, Fred, you're responsible for John's hours.
Exactly.
You know? John, you're responsible for Fred's hours. You're both exempt.
Exactly.
It doesn't work that way.
No, it doesn't. And the whole goal of that is so you don't have to pay overtime.
Right.
And so that doesn't fly. And so if that employee were to go and file a complaint, you'd be in a lot of trouble. And so then there's back pay for all those hours, all that overtime that you would have to pay, along with possibly a fine if that was reported to the Department of Labor, who's responsible for that.
What's the reasoning behind not paying overtime for exempt employees? I mean, what makes that legal?
Because of the number of hours that they may be required to work in order to get their job done. So they typically, an exempt employee may be required to work more than 8 hours because of the level of control they have over their work day. So in addition to not to working more hours, if they work fewer hours, you can't change their salary. They still have the same salary. So if I take off today, don't come to work, you cannot deduct that day's wage from their salary. So
Would that apply to salespeople?
it would depend on sometimes with outside salespeople, and that's because of the nature of their work.
Right.
They're away from the office. It's a lot of travel involved. So it depends on the nature of their work. Each position would be different, but typically a salesperson is not exempt. The other pitfall is just not having someone that's familiar with human resources to kind of keep things from getting out of control, making sure that everybody is professional in the workplace. You don't say or do things that are going to be offensive. Part of that would be in your employee handbook. That's a big thing that a lot of small businesses don't have, an employee handbook. That puts everybody on notice as to what is acceptable behavior, not just what's illegal.
Okay.
It's before you get to illegal, you want to say, in our company, the behavior must be professional and free of any kind of harassment. Okay, but professional behavior, if you're professional, then all the rest of it goes away. You don't have to worry about discrimination. You don't have to worry about sexual harassment because you're being professional. And so those are the kind of things you want to stress in your employee handbook, and it puts everyone on notice. The owner may be on notice and understand what's important and how you want to treat your employees, but you may have someone, a supervisor, who doesn't quite appreciate that. But
You have to make sure that you're educating everyone.
educating everyone, and you educate your employees to know when things are incorrect and they shouldn't be done, because they'll do it to a coworker, and then you could be held responsible if you don't take care of it. But if you have someone in a supervisory position, you are liable for whatever discrimination that they engage in. You correct it, and that'll limit your liability. But once you have someone in a supervisory position, then you're responsible. So you want to make sure that everybody who's in the company is behaving in a professional manner. Even your customers. Okay. Your customers can harass your employees, and you could be responsible for that.
And you're responsible for stopping your customers from harassing your employees?
Yes, you are.
Okay.
Or you are responsible for that. So say, for instance, that you own a coffee shop, and there's a customer that comes in, and every time he comes in, he makes, awful comments, to some of the female staff. Okay. Okay, and he does it all the time. And then you have people who have told you, or you've even witnessed it, and you say, "Oh, calm down, don't say that." And
he's a customer, he's always right.
Exactly. So some of the employees, it's not a big deal, but there may be an employee where it is a big deal. It's very offensive. And that person says something to you, and you don't do anything about it. Okay. That's harassment. It's sexual harassment, and you could be held liable for that.
So it's up to you to do something to tell that person to stop doing it.
To stop doing it. And if they can't stop, then they don't need to come to your restaurant.
Right.
Or your coffee shop. So those kinds of things you really want to be aware of. And again, those are the things you put in your employee handbook, that you don't tolerate any kind of harassment. And if that happens, you give them a process. What do they need to do if that happens? Who do they report to? So those are the kind of things that get sometimes smaller companies in trouble. And as I mentioned, you know, you have one lawsuit and it could wipe you out. So bigger companies, larger companies, they prepare for that. They go through the training. In California, every 2 years, if you have any supervisory personnel, they have to go through sexual harassment training. 2 hours every 2 years.
And that's at what size?
That's at 50 employees.
At 50 employees.
Okay. So at 50 employees, it's mandated that you train your supervisors. But if you have fewer employees, it's not mandated, but you still want to protect yourself.
You're still liable for it, even though
Right.
the law doesn't say that you have to go through the training.
Exactly. But you do need to take care of whatever issues there are that happen along those lines of discrimination and harassment. So.
And this is pretty easy to do. I mean, you and I were talking earlier that Cantola Productions, I've done some work for them, helping them create some of these tools. I think their videos are like $100 or something, and you can buy it and share it with your staff so that they can, you know, I mean, you don't have to personally train folks. There's training available.
There's training available. And you get a sign-in sheet, you know, so proof that they were trained. And so at that point, it limits your liability because you have a system in place. And you can, if something happens, you can say, okay, this is the training that I gave, and it'll limit your liability. And then you come in and you handle whatever that is that happened. You take care of it. If there's disciplinary action that needs to happen, then that happens. If it's just further training, then that happens. So you just really have to make sure that as an employer, that people are on notice as to what behavior is acceptable.
What about salespeople? Compensation for salespeople? Are there you know, you want to pay somebody strictly commission? Can you do that?
Yeah, you can do it. You can pay strictly commission.
So does that make them an exempt employer, or is it a special category?
Well, it's a special category. It's commission only, so it's a special category. So they wouldn't necessarily be considered exempt, but you have a contract with them that there is no salary involved at all. So if they finish their work in 2 hours, you know, they're going to make the same money. I mean, if they make those sales in 2 hours, they're going to make the same money than if it took them 8 hours to make the same sales. So,
But they could still be an employee.
yes, they could still be an employee just on commission only, and that's a separate type of agreement. So you would want to have, when you hire an employee, you want to have an employment agreement with each employee that lines out exactly what they're doing and what their classification is. If they're exempt, then that needs to be in the agreement. If they're non-exempt, an hourly employee, and they get overtime, that needs to be in the agreement. Or if they're commission, or if they're part salary and part commission, all of that should be outlined in the employment agreement. And that, again, that's one of the things that small businesses sometimes don't do. It's just an agreement. And we just talk about what you're going to do, and then you show up and you start working. And you have no written agreement. So there's nothing to fall back on whenever there's a dispute.
Right. And in the realm of agreements, too, it just occurred to me, profit sharing agreements and all these things, these would have to really be well defined ahead of time. Not just some sort of vague, hey, you know, if I make extra money this week, I'll give you some or something, you know, right? You have to, it should be, and what, you need an employment attorney for that, or do you need a?
You probably would. If you're talking about profit sharing, you would need to get some legal advice on that to make sure that it's written correctly and that all your bases are covered. So, yeah, I would definitely get an attorney.
You know, I know for a lot of small businesses, they want to leverage some sort of incentive to try to bring that in, but if it's informal, it could be bad. Once you're offering equity incentive, it's much more obvious that you have to have everything legally documented and stuff. But sometimes the profit sharing thing seems like you could play a little more fast and loose.
With the profit sharing, you can. Yeah, I need to correct that. Yeah, with the profit sharing, you can. I was thinking more in the lines of equity.
Okay.
But yes, with profit sharing, you can do that. You don't necessarily need to have an attorney to do that. You could have an HR person work that out. But I was thinking more in lines of equity.
Okay. But so profit sharing. So if you were going to do if one wanted to say, okay, we want to do a profit sharing, you know, who do we need to talk to help us get that agreement so it's clear and it's, you know, somebody can't accuse you of not paying off on what that was.
You know, it would really depend on how in depth that agreement was. You know, as far as profit sharing, you might still want to talk to an attorney. If nothing else, you'd want to go over it with an HR professional to make sure that everything is set up correctly and that it's all documented. But that's something that, depending on how in-depth the profit sharing opportunity was, you may want to still talk to an attorney.
But it still should not be just a verbal
No,
agreement.
definitely never just a verbal agreement.
Sure.
Yes. Because verbal agreements, you can be held, to those. If you say, oh, well, your salary is going to be $60,000 a year and you're going to work for the next year, and you're just talking, okay?
Right.
So, and then things don't quite work out and you say, okay, I'm going to let the person go. And then they say, well, you told me I had a contract for a year. You told me I was going to be here for a year. And so you could end up being liable to paying that contract out.
Right. Where, it's all up to people's memory, whereas if it was written out, they can't say you said stuff. You could say, well, this is what it's written.
Right.
So.
Exactly. And even if it's not necessarily a legitimate claim, if you have to defend yourself against that claim, it could still cost you a lot more money than it would just to pay out that contract. So that's why you want to make sure that everything is in writing.
So one of the things I really want to do with this program is to put some of the tools and best practices that have been researched and paid for by big business and bring those to the small business person who may not be aware of them. So what are some of the things that are going on with HR in big business that can be adapted to for the small business owner?
Well, I think one of the big things with HR is that bigger businesses are really starting to look at HR as a business partner. And you'll see advertisements for HR business partners, strategic HR managers. So they're really beginning to see how important it is to have your employees engaged and in focus with the company culture. And so when you think about it, and they've already realized this, that your largest expense is going to be your people. That is your greatest expense. But many times in the past, that was kind of left to the side. Oh, you have the HR people, they fill out the paperwork, and that was basically it. But
They always just say, oh, our people are our most important thing, and that's about as far as it went.
That's as far as it went. But now people are really beginning to appreciate how important it is for you to have your employees engaged in the company and really working to support the company. And so because of that, larger businesses have really seen the need to partner with HR and to make sure that they're in at the beginning stages of whatever strategic plan, whatever growth plan that they have in place, is to make sure that HR is there at the beginning and they're the liaison and they are the spokesperson for the employees and the company to make sure everything flows properly. Because if your employees are not happy, you're going to have issues with your business. Your customers aren't going to be happy. And so you want to make sure that they're engaged. And because it's such a huge expense, it's better to take advantage of it the best way you can than to, have employees who are just there doing a job, collecting a paycheck, and they've left and they could care less whether or not the company is profitable.
Right.
So big companies have really begun to focus on that. And so you'll see a lot of companies that are now beginning to outsource large portions of their human resource departments because they're professional organizations that that's all they do is focus on HR and focus on getting the best and the most out of your people. And so you'll see a lot of that. I think small businesses can actually take a look at that and see there are many options that they can afford, even on a tight budget, that be it consulting with an HR person, outsourcing some of your HR responsibilities. So I think that's one big thing. And then the other thing I was going to mention about big businesses have really set the tone for focusing the organization on their culture. And really, what message do you want to send out to the globe, to globally, about your company, your culture, and your brand? And so small businesses can take that information and use that. While you're small, what is the image? What is the culture? What is the brand that you want to put out globally?
Right.
And base all of your planning and your strategies around that brand and that culture. And then your employees, everything, you want them to feel that culture. not to force them into it, but you want them to genuinely adopt the culture that your company has and represent the brand the way you want it to be seen to the world. And that comes with recruiting also. When you're recruiting, you want to make sure that as you're recruiting, people see the culture and the brand. They identify with that and they can say, okay, you know what? I really don't like that culture. I don't want to work there. So that way, you know, a person knows up front, this is what's going to be expected. This is how we do business. So if they're not comfortable with that, then, you know, they won't apply for that position.
Okay, so the thing that comes to mind is the moving company, and there are the ones. There's the guy with the truck. There's the starving students. There's the guys who come in the uniform, and they're all pressed and very professional. How does the business owner communicate to his employees, you know, how we're presenting ourselves and make them feel comfortable about it?
To get them on board, you start off in the hiring phase, if possible. You start off with the hiring phase. If you're trying to reintroduce the company, then you bring the employees along with that. You say, this is what we're doing. We want to reintroduce, we're trying to establish a brand that is seen globally as a customer-friendly, customer service brand. And we're trying to reintroduce that. And so you bring your employees along with training, with education about why you're doing it, how it's going to benefit the company, and then how it's going to benefit the employees. So you want to get buy-in. You want them to engage and to engage and be part of the cultural shift.
Yeah.
So
you don't want them to go, this is what the boss wants. Yeah.
Right. Well, they say we do it this way, but we really don't.
Right.
So you want buy-in. You want to engage your employees in that cultural shift. And so if you start off at the beginning and you get input from your employees, you take suggestions. You ask for, what do you think? What do you think the company brand should be like? You know, and once you get buy-in like that, then you'll have employees that are going to support that, and they're going to be engaged, and they're going to be concerned about whether or not the company is profitable. You always want to highlight, what are the benefits? It's like when you're recruiting for a job and you're talking to the candidates, and you tell them about all the benefits you have, why it's so great to work at this company. You want them to come on. And so you give them all that information. Once they get hired, you want to continue to reiterate, why is it so great to work at our company? How are you benefiting? Look at what the things that we have. We appreciate you. So you want to do all those things. That keeps your employees engaged. That makes them want to stay with the company. That makes them refer quality people to the company that they work for. And that's how you retain exceptional talent. The other thing, as far as that really involves HR, is businesses to be conscious about protecting themselves against any kind of legal liabilities. And so larger companies will purchase what is called ELPI insurance, and that's Employee Liability Protection Insurance. And for a large company, it can be a huge expense. But for a smaller company, you could start off with, say, a $1,200 a year premium. And that insurance is going to protect you from claims and legal issues dealing with employees. So that's something that smaller companies could consider and look into that as a protection for them.
Yeah, there are some legal insurance, small business legal insurance programs, like a prepaid kind of program. And I don't know if those would cover. We have to do a show on that sometime. And what tools small business could use to protect themselves from, not only employer-related things, but other. There's awful lot of liability as soon as you hang your shingle out there. So
it is a lot of liability, and at the same time, that liability could pass on to the business owner, whereas not just the company, but the business owner, particularly sole proprietor, could be personally held responsible for any type of a judgment or anything that would go against the company.
So it occurs to me as we talk about all these liability issues, I've spent most of my career as a sole proprietor with employees, and perhaps I've just been fortunate, but as you incorporate or use an LLC or some other thing, does that afford you some protection from these types of lawsuits, or do they still go after you?
Well, they still go after you, but it does afford you protection personally, so that if the corporation is sued, your personal assets are protected. So that's something to look at once you begin to hire employees is, speak with legal counsel and see if that's going to be the best way for you to go. But it does afford you a measure of protection personally.
So many companies, the motivation is, well, so you won't get in trouble, right? But that doesn't seem to be a really great motivator from everything I've read. So how do you motivate people? Talk about what are some of the ways that you can get folks, you were talking about getting people on board, but to get them to really be proactive and to think of solutions and that kind of thing.
Yes. Well, I think the way to get people on board, I believe in the 3 R's of talent acquisition and management. And the first thing is recruiting. So you recruit exceptional people. You're looking for people that other companies may not realize that they're an exceptional talent. So you're looking for those different kinds of people, not just skill-wise, but great fit. So that's going to be an excellent employee or an exceptional employee for your business, but maybe not for another business because they fit your culture. So you start off there. After you get these exceptional people, then you want to recognize their talents. So on a daily basis, you recognize your employees in large and small ways. But you recognize them and give them recognition based on things that they value, not what you value.
Okay.
So for instance, I had an assistant, and she was an excellent assistant, but she loved to go to the movies, but she did not want to pay full price to go to the movies. So I would often get her movie tickets for she and her husband. I'd get her 2 movie tickets. And that meant so much to her because she wanted to go see the movie, but she wasn't going to pay for it. So I recognized her for great things she did, and all it took was a couple movie tickets, and she was thrilled with that. So it's not always large monetary rewards, a simple handwritten thank you note. Can you imagine you come in and you've got a handwritten thank you note from your boss?
Wow.
How many people do that?
Yeah.
So when your employees realize that you are concerned about them as an individual, then you get buy-in. And then also that buy-in occurs when you allow them to have a stake in the company. When you say stakeholders, they should really be stakeholders. They should really have a stake in the company. So that means that you're concerned about what it is that they feel is important, an important direction for the business to go. You're soliciting suggestions.
So you're not talking about financial stake necessarily.
No, just a stake as in you have a stake as to whether this business is successful or not, and it's going to impact you. Not just keeping your job, but the idea that I'm fulfilled by coming to work. So if you spend 8 to 10 hours a day working and getting to work and you're not fulfilled in that job or you don't feel engaged, then basically you're just coming to collect a paycheck. And if somebody offers you a bigger check, then you're gone.
Right.
So if the employee is engaged and they feel they have a stake, I can give a suggestion. It's acted upon.
That
People
their
look
ideas
at
matter.
it. Their ideas matter. All those kinds of things are going to keep the employee engaged. So when they give a suggestion, if it's a good suggestion, act on it. Don't just take suggestions and ignore them.
Right.
Or acknowledge that, the suggestion was given. Not just for suggestions that save money and and that's great. If they save money, they get a portion of what they saved. Some companies do that. That's great. But really get those suggestions coming. You've got all those brains, and so you want to tap in to all that knowledge that you have on your staff. And so recognizing that is going to encourage them. And once you do that, then you're going to retain. So that means that you're going to retain your exceptional talent that you've invested all that money in. It costs so much more to hire and retrain than it does to keep that employee. So typically about 3 times the amount of that annual salary that the employee makes. That's how much it's going to cost you to retrain and hire a new employee. So that's why it's so important to do the 3 R's: recruit right, recognize, and then you get retention.
Okay. And then, it occurs to me that of all the things that a lot of the things that we've talked about, it's difficult it's more difficult for smaller businesses than for larger businesses in some ways to comply because they don't have that dedicated HR person to do all this stuff. And it just seems like but this is something that actually seems like it would be easier for a small business to take advantage than a large business because they have that personal connection with their employees. And so I'm always looking for the ways that small businesses can actually outcompete larger businesses. And this seems like a perfect one, is to really know your employees and engage them.
Right. That personal one-on-one. As a small business owner, you have that a lot more than a larger company would have. So you get to know the person, you know their family most of the time. So, showing some concern about the family, all those kinds of things, it really keeps employees engaged. That's why with a lot of small businesses, you'll see employees who have been there forever. And then their kids come to work for them, in the same company. And it's because of that atmosphere.
Yeah, now that is one thing when we talk about the employee handbook and all these sort of formal sort of things, that are more, we associate more with corporate America. How does one retain that family feeling and at the same time get get all the I's dotted and the T's crossed?
Well, that's why the handbook is so important, because a person comes on to the company, they get the handbook, you go over the handbook, you go over any policies and training that you need to have, and that's done. So they have that reference point, and now it's not like you're constantly saying this is illegal, that is illegal. You have your notices that you have to post. So you have that already that's required. So when you have your handbook, that's the place that you can refer to. So it keeps everything on an even keel. If there's an issue, you just refer back to the policy.
I see.
So you can still have that same atmosphere because you're not constantly harping on what's illegal and what's not illegal, is what's professional. So you can have a family atmosphere, small business atmosphere, and still be professional.
So we've covered a lot of ground, and I'd like you, if you can, just to sort of summarize the most important things for a very small business owner to consider in their hiring process.
Okay. The most important thing I think for a small business owner to consider is prepare before you hire. Before you make your first hire, be prepared. Find out what the ramifications are going to be for you as a small business and what you're going to be responsible to as far as compliance to with the federal and state laws. The next thing I would say is for small businesses not to say, well, it doesn't apply to me, I'm too small.
Right.
Because you're not too small if you have one employee. So consider that.
So yeah, we discussed that even though you may not be required to do certain trainings and fulfill certain requirements, you're still liable should you get sued.
Correct. And as I mentioned, there's over 14 federal laws that a small business, a small business with one employee has to comply with. So you want to know what those are. Some may not particularly apply to the small business owner who doesn't have government contracts or doesn't subcontract with the government, but there are others that do. So you want to know what those are.
And then there are state laws.
It's state laws, exactly. And when it comes to federal and state laws concerning an employee, whichever law is more favorable to the employee, that's what you must comply with. So, and that's in any state. The other thing that I would say for small businesses, not to automatically say, I can't afford it. So to do some research, there are some economical things you can do when it comes to human resources, outsourcing, consulting, but just don't automatically assume I can't afford it, so I'm not going to investigate. You want to investigate, find out what your options are. Things are becoming less expensive because there's so much available on the internet. So really look at what it is that you can do at an economical price. The other thing that's important for small businesses is to, if you don't know, ask. Always ask. Never assume, never jump into something when it comes to employees without knowledge. So find out what's correct. It may be going to the Department of Labor website. It may be calling a consultant. It may be networking. But you definitely want to find out and not make assumptions when it comes to employees.
Great. Well, it seems like there's an awful lot to consider, but boils down to stuff that even small businesses can do.
Exactly.
Well, thanks a lot for being here. I really appreciate it and helping us out with this. Your contact information is going to be at the bottom of our page, so anybody that does want to contact Bernadette can. And thanks for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it.